It is a period of civil war. Rebel spaceships striking from a hidden base have won their first victory against the evil galactic empire. During the battle, rebel spies managed to steal secret plans to the Empire's ultimate weapon, the Death Star, an armored space station with enough power to destroy an entire planet. Pursued by the Empire's sinister agents, Princess Leia races home aboard her starship, custodian of the stolen plans that can save her problem and restore freedom to the galaxy. What movie is this from? Star Wars. What episode is it from? What is it? New Hope? Bonus points. Episode 4. That's right. Episode 4 of Star Wars, or episode 1 to all of our friends who are over 50. We understand. Come on. We know it's the original. Whichever. But this is the opening crawl to the most famous plot in cinema history. Let's be honest. Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, there is this evil, oppressive, power-hungry galactic empire, and the heroes of the story are all a part of the rebellion, right? The rebels who dream of a galaxy free from this oppression and the evil rule of the empire. You know how the story goes. If you don't, you're about 50 years late to this story, okay? Rebellions are a group of people who push against the status quo. They don't do what they're expected to do, especially because they're driven to see change. They want to change the way things are. And with stories like Star Wars, we often view rebellions as the good guys, right? They're fighting for the freedom of the galaxy. That's a good cause. We all can get behind that, right? Except it's actually estimated that in blowing up the Death Star, they killed about 1.5 million people in that act, okay? Yeah, you're never going to view Star Wars the same ever again after that. So it's like, oh, who are the good guys here? Either way, this is the case for rebellions, the Maccabean War in the 300s BC, when the Jews rebelled against the Greek Empire to reclaim Jerusalem and have a period of peace. The American Revolutionary War was a rebel against the British Empire so that they could launch a country that is free with limited government. I mean, rebellions can even take small, subtle forms, right? All y'all's new fashion trends these days as a rebellion against what's, common for the normal person to wear with all these high-waisted pants, whatever that's about. That cannot be comfortable. I do not understand it. It's a rebellion of sorts, And most would say that rebellions are good things as long as you side with the rebellion. Because what about the other side? To the majority, to the status quo, the rebels are the bad guys. The Galactic Empire was the good guys in their minds, and the rebels were terrorists, if you think about it. Or if you're, think that you wear normal clothes, you look at all these trendy people thinking, what do they know, right? Like, you tend to side with the status quo if you're on the status quo, and you can't possibly see the good that could come from that rebellion. So much so that you might even see from the status quo's perspective, the rebels need to be mocked, ridiculed, punished, maybe even destroyed. And that's exactly where we find Jesus at his trial. Because the status quo viewed Jesus as a rebel, in severe need of punishment, and even extermination. We're in week 3 of our current sermon series called The Passion. The Passion. We're looking at the Passion of the Christ. Passion Week, essentially. It starts with the triumphal entry in the Gospels, and then every event that goes on from there is alluding to this week of suffering that Jesus endured that ultimately ended with the resurrection on Easter Sunday. So we're looking at 5 key events during Passion Week leading up to Easter. So 2 weeks ago, Mason talked about the triumphal entry to kick off Passion Week. Last week, we talked about the opposition. We looked at how Judas betrayed Jesus, Peter denied Jesus, and then the disciples went on the offensive to defend Jesus falsely, right? So now we move on to the next event in Passion Week, and it's the trial of Jesus. It's the trial of Jesus. So we're going to continue reading from Luke's account of these events. So if you have a Bible or a Bible app, go ahead and turn with me to Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 66. If you want to read along to me, we're going to hop over into Luke 23, ending with verse 25. Yeah, we're starting at the end of one chapter and going into the next one. It's crazy how that works sometimes. We don't often do that in church. So as you're turning there, for you to reference, to recap, Jesus was on the Mount of Olives to pray with his disciples, to prepare for his pending arrest. Then the Jewish leaders and priests show up with Judas to arrest him and to bring him before the Sanhedrin. Okay, the Sanhedrin is the fancy word for the governing body that oversaw the Jews from the religious standpoint, but also from the civilization standpoint. Okay, so this is where our story begins in Luke 22, starting in verse 66. And then we'll read to chapter 23, verse 2 to start. At daybreak, all the elders of the people assembled, including the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. Jesus was led before this high council, and they said, "Tell us, are you the Messiah?" But he replied, "If I tell you, you won't believe me. And if I ask a question, you won't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated in the place of power at God's right hand." They all shouted, "So are you claiming to be the Son of God?" And he replied, "You say that I am." "Why do we need other witnesses?" they said. "We ourselves heard him say it." Then the entire council took Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor. They began to state their case. "This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming he is the Messiah, a king." All right, let's pause there for a second. The elders, priests, and teachers of the law come together at this high council to get Jesus to basically kind of confess in a weird way that he is the Messiah, the anointed one of God. In fact, he is the Son of God who has come to set the people free. This was true, wasn't it? This is true. This is who Jesus is. But to the religious elite, the status quo, this was 100% a rebellion from what they understood to be true. Everything about Jesus' life and teachings and actions went against what they expected the true Messiah to be. They could not believe his claim. He was a rebel. So they used that as a reason to bring Jesus before Pilate, the Roman governor over this Roman province of ancient Palestine, because the elders and priests wanted Jesus dead. However, you can't legally kill somebody unless the government does it for you. So they bring Jesus to Pilate with 3 indictments to try to get him killed. And here are the 3 indictments that come from chapter 23, verse 2. They accuse Jesus of leading our people astray, encouraging people not to pay taxes to Caesar, and claiming that Jesus is a king, or literally is the Christ. It's another word for king. So those last 2 indictments on this list would be particularly pertinent to Pilate as they're direct threats to the Roman Empire, okay? Like, people should pay their taxes. If you don't, you'll get punished. We're all aware of that right now. Tax season. Hello. Further, claiming that Christ is a king is particularly troublesome, so this would pipe up Pilate's radars, essentially. But those 2 specific indictments come from the more general indictment that Jesus was leading our people astray. Another way you can translate that phrase is Jesus is subverting our nation. That sounds a lot like a rebellion to me, don't you think? To subvert a nation? That's extreme. So, you got to think, this is Jesus we're talking about. Where do these extreme accusations come from? Well, this has been a long time coming for Jesus because Jesus constantly challenged the status quo with the religious elite and their presuppositions of how God's law was supposed to go. Of course, they were in the wrong, and Jesus called them out, and they didn't like it. So here's just a couple of examples of Jesus stirring the pot and rebelling against the status quo and what ultimately led to his trial in this instance. So here's the first example. Luke 4, 16 through 30. Jesus is in his hometown of Nazareth. He reads from the scroll of Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 2, and he claimed the prophecy applied to himself. And that stirred the pot up so much that the people in his hometown decided to take him and capture him and tried to throw him off a cliff. They clearly had their status quo challenged. Or how about if you hop over to some of the instances when Jesus challenges the Pharisees about their traditions regarding the Sabbath day. In one instance, Jesus heals a man's hand on the Sabbath. On another instance, he gets a crippled man to walk on the Sabbath day. And for some reason, this really ticked off the Pharisees and religious leaders because he challenged the status quo. And this is actually what triggered the Pharisees to finally start plotting against him to figure out how can we kill him. Or in John chapter 10, Jesus refers to himself as being God because of the work and miracles he's doing. This was absolutely going against the status quo because no one can claim that they are God. That is blasphemy at the highest level to them. So they tried to seize him, but he elusively escapes. He does that a lot. He just slips right through their fingers all the time, you know? Or even after the triumphal entry into Jerusalem that Mason talked about a couple of weeks ago, he starts flipping tables, right, of all the merchants, running them out of the temple grounds because they have abused God's holy grounds. To them, that was the status quo, and Jesus was the rebel. And all of this, just happens in so many different areas of Jesus calling out the false spirituality, the false status quo that the religious elite had established. And that's why they most likely viewed Jesus as this rebel. But here's the irony. It was the religious elite who were the rebels, weren't they? Because they had strayed away from God's way and were thus falsely accusing Jesus of crimes that had no grounds. So, that's what's kind of crazy about this whole story. When we read this story and we find examples of people giving false accusations about Jesus, misinterpreting his words, right, making him out to be a rebellion, we think of so many other examples for our own modern life of people who falsely accuse Jesus and rebel against him, right? People who just basically the equivalent of prodigal sons, living in their sin, not even caring about what Jesus wants them to do with their life. They're just wasting their life away. Atheists who want nothing to do with God and to just say, all religion is bad for society. People who misinterpret Christ's words and think, that anyone who follows him are a bigot, right? These are the people we assume are rebels against God's way. Pagans who don't know who God is. They're the evil ones, right? Well, in this story, it's not the pagans who accuse Jesus. It's the religious people. It's God's people who are getting all stirred up by what Jesus is doing. In fact, it's the pagans who want Jesus let free, who claim that he's innocent, right? So we get to this next portion in Luke 23, beginning in verse 3, when Pilate starts hearing these claims that Jesus might be king. And here's how this all fleshes out. Okay, so Pilate asked him, verse 3, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replied, "You have said it." And Pilate turned to the leading priests and to the crowd and said, "I find nothing wrong with this man. He's innocent." Then they became insistent, "But he is causing riots by his teaching wherever he goes, all over Judea from Galilee to Jerusalem." Stirring up a rebellion, essentially. Doesn't that sound like it? "Oh, so he's a Galilean?" Pilate asked. When they said that he was, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction, and Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. Okay, so let's pause there for a moment. Here's some context. So King Herod Antipas is the grandson or the son. He's a descendant of King Herod the Great. We all remember King Herod the Great, the King Herod who wanted all the babies killed because, Jesus came into earth as a king and all that stuff, right? That King Herod, King Herod Antipas was specifically assigned to oversee the region of Galilee, which is where Jesus is from. Because all of these events of the Easter story and Passion Week are happening during the Passover celebration, there is a massive influx of Jews into Jerusalem. So that's why Pilate is in Jerusalem. He's normally over in Caesarea. And then this is also why Herod Antipas is down here in Jerusalem as well. So Pilate's like, oh, if he's from Galilee, and then Herod actually oversees Galilee, let's just pass Jesus over to him and have Herod Antipas make the decision. Okay? Smooth move, Herod. Smooth move, Pilate. So here's how that goes. Verse 8, Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus because he had heard about him and had been hoping for a long time to see him perform a miracle. And he asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus refused to answer. And meanwhile, the leading priests and the teachers of religious law stood here shouting their accusations. Then Herod and his soldiers began mocking and ridiculing Jesus. Finally, they put a royal robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate, who had been enemies before, became friends that day. So King Herod, another pagan Roman official, was excited to meet Jesus. In fact, it kind of reads he was hoping that Jesus would perform some sort of a magic trick, basically, right? Do one of those cool miracles, Jesus. Come on, let's see it. But when he realizes that he's not getting anything from Jesus, he's silent just as much with Herod as he was with Pilate, it wasn't going anywhere. But then notice it's the religious elite who started mocking Jesus first, and then Herod and his guards chime in. So they mock him, they give him a hard time, they put this purple robe, just kind of mocking his kingship, essentially, and then they send him back to Pilate. Let's continue on in verse 13. Then Pilate called together the leading priests and other religious leaders along with the people, and he announced his verdict. You brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt, of leading a rebellion, essentially. And I have examined him thoroughly on this point in your presence and find him innocent. Herod came to the same conclusion and sent him back to us. Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty, so I will have him flogged, and then I will release him. Then a mighty roar rose from the crowd, and with one voice they shouted, "Kill him and release Barabbas to us." Barabbas was in prison for taking part in an insurrection in Jerusalem against the government, in a rebellion, and for murder. Verse 20, Pilate argued with them because he wanted to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." For the third time, he demanded, "Why? What crime has he committed? I have found no reason to sentence him to death, so I will have him flogged and then I will release him." But the mob shouted louder and louder, demanding that Jesus be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate sentenced Jesus to die as they demanded. As they had requested, he released Barabbas, the man in prison for insurrection and murder, but he turned Jesus over to them to do as they wished. These religious people, God's own chosen people, claimed Jesus was leading a rebellion, and in his place, they released a true rebel, Barabbas. And it was the pagans who wanted Jesus released, who saw him innocent. So this begs the question for us, okay? How does Jesus rebel against our status quo? How does Jesus rebel against our status quo? How does he stir the pot of the life that we want to live? Because maybe for some of us, we just want to live our comfortable lives. We come to church on Sundays. We know it's the right thing to do. We're pretty comfortable with how things are, and we just keep it at that. And we ignore that Jesus calls us to a life of surrender. We don't like that. We don't like that. Or how about when we want to cling to how we want to mistreat and mishandle our money? It's our finances. We want to get this thing, we want to get that thing right. The whole idea of generosity, trying to bless those who have less. Jesus, I'm not going to listen to that. Nope. It's challenging my status quo. Hidden addictions that we might have, that we just keep insisting on having in our life, whether that's pornography, whether that's alcohol, whether that's negative body image that you might have towards yourself, or any of those things, right? If we insist on hanging on to these sins, it's like, oh, surely Jesus is fine with it. Surely it's not that big of a deal. But you read passages like from 1 John when it says, if we are in Christ and we will sin no more, Jesus, nope, not about that. Not about that. Or perhaps maybe we get really comfortable with automatically assuming, like, if we vote a certain way, if we ascribe ourselves to a certain political party, right, then that's the equivalent of being on the same board with Jesus. And it's, no, that's not necessarily true. Jesus exists outside of our political spectrums. And perhaps we might falsely accuse Jesus of being right-wing Republican and all those on Democrats, right, or the enemy, when really Jesus calls all of us out of our shells. What is our status quo? What is the normal part of your life that you've gotten so accustomed to because you just assume this is how Christianity is, this is how my life is, I just want to be comfortable, I don't want to live, my sin's fine enough, I'm fine enough right now. But for the longest time, Christ has been calling you out of it. And we have the hardest time with those kind of words because we're so used to the status quo. And what often happens is when we get challenged by these things, we all know that thing. We all have that status quo thing we know Christ is calling us out on. I guarantee you, if we dig deep enough, we know what it is. And if we push back in any way, we're like, no, Jesus, you're not having that, we're essentially marking him as a rebel. But listen, trialing Jesus as a rebel against our lives reveals the extent of our own rebellion. Okay? Trialing Jesus as a rebel against our lives reveals the extent of our own rebellion. Jesus wasn't the rebel. The status quo was the rebel. He just simply came to make things right? To give us the way to the truth and to life. And anything we insist on doing, he's here to disrupt. He's here to disrupt. And yet, if we continue on in our opposition, in our status quo, it's no different from us joining that mob, crucifying him all over again. So I'm going to invite Mason back up here, and we're going to move into just some extended time of worship here. Here's the craziest part for me. In this entire sequence, in this entire event of Passion Week, okay? It was Jewish custom to release a prisoner on the Passover celebration. So instead of choosing to release Jesus, who was innocent, the crowd chose Barabbas, an insurrectionist, a literal rebel responsible for murdering innocent people against the government. And you know what else is crazy? The name Barabbas literally means son of the Father. And so this crowd, this mob, chose to crucify the true Son of the Father in Jesus so that they could have this false Son of the Father back with them. And what blows my mind is in this instance, Jesus fulfilled yet another prophecy about what he was meant to do as the Messiah. When Jesus was talking to his disciples that night before he would be betrayed, he says in Luke 22, verse 37, "For the time has come for this prophecy about me to be fulfilled. He was counted among the rebels. Yes, everything written about me by the prophets will come true." Okay, so Jesus is saying that he was fulfilling what Isaiah the prophet says in Isaiah 53, verse 12, written hundreds of years before Jesus even came into the picture. Want to know what it said? Here's what it says. "I will give him," this is a reference to Jesus, "the honors of a victorious soldier because he exposed himself to death. He was counted among the rebels, and he bore the sins of many and interceded for rebels." In other words, Jesus was trialed as a rebel so the rebels could be saved. What? He took on the punishment of an insurrectionist despite our own insurrectionist tendencies against God's ways. The gavel has dropped. The trial is over. Our case is clean. We're innocent. We're innocent. The main thing is, if that is true, if we are innocent and God no longer sees our sin, but instead he sees Christ in us, then we need to live as if it's true. We need to live as if it's true. If Christ died for you to be free from your sin and condemnation, we must live like that is the case. I love what 1 John chapter 3 says, verses 4 through 6. Here's what it says. "Everyone who sins is breaking God's law, for all sin is contrary to the law of God. And you know that Jesus came to take away our sins, and there is no sin in him. And anyone who continues to live in him will not sin. But anyone who keeps on sinning does not know him or understand who he is." Obviously, we can't live a perfectly sinless life. We're all going to make mistakes, right? But he is saying we come to a crossroads here, okay? When you look at the status quo, when Jesus challenges and stirs up the pot against what you have been used to and grown accustomed to, you're given two choices. You can either trial Jesus as a rebel and just continue to crucify him basically and ignore him, or you can surrender to him as your king. You can trial him as a rebel, or you can surrender to him as king. Say, God, have my life. I'm over this thing. I'm over trying to just do this up by myself and just trying to check off all the boxes. As soon as you can acknowledge that you are a rebel, that we all are rebels, we choose just to submit to his will in whatever way that looks like, devoting ourselves to his teachings, growing in worship with him, getting more involved in your local church, and working on those things he's calling out. Then maybe we also will start to live as rebels to a world that pushes against the grain of what we stand for. But I think it'll be so much more worth it. So let's join the rebellion, y'all.